Nick Matchups. I'm a CPE student here, and I work at Bethel Seminary as the Director of Internship and Placement.
Hi, Steve Solmonson. I'm a senior at Luther Seminary, and here as a resident.
Carolyn Filstrom, also a chaplain resident. Okay, catch the two in the back.
Eric Anderson. I'm a chaplain intern.
Michael Dunn.
Kim DeVore, I'm a chaplain resident.
Judy Connolly, I'm a staff chaplain here.
Adam James, staff chaplain here with primarily with dual diagnosis adolescents.
Joni App, chaplain resident.
Bethany Schmall, chaplain resident. Cynthia Anderson Bauer, I'm a staff chaplain and OB on the neonatal ICU.
Christine Belfry Johnson, second year student at Luther, MDiv student, and I am a chaplain intern.
Cheryl Linestone, a clinical pastoral educator.
Yo Habermester, and I'm a staff chaplain here, and I work in rehab and with grief and a partial program.
Carrie Eustace, and I'm a chaplain educator here.
Derek Bowerly. I'm a second year student at UTS, interfaith chaplaincy, and I'm an intern.
Thank you. Thank you. If you bear with me, I'll be flipping slides here a little bit as we go. I do want to also mention that there'll be a hard copy of all of the slides that are available for you to take at the end of the workshop today, so don't feel as if you need to be taking notes. Feel free to do that, but you don't have to. And also was interested, in addition to having learned who you are and where you work, just curious about any kind of training or experience people have had, whether formal or informal, either as part of an investigative team or as a participant in research that might or might not be in chaplaincy. Everybody doesn't have to, we don't have to go around and hear from everyone, but just curious, anybody with experience doing research of any kind?
Oh, sure. My master's was all in a research project.
Oh, what was the research project?
You won't believe me if I tell you.
Oh, sure I will.
Now, I did a public relations image survey of a minor league baseball team within the New York Mets organization, and spent 2 years studying the community and the club and everything around it, and the Air Force paid for the whole thing because I was there as an Air Force officer,
Wow.
which was my boondoggle. They wanted me to analyze media coverage of the Gulf War for the Pentagon, and I said, I have another idea.
Fascinating, and as you laid out that title, I was thinking just substitute the term chaplaincy, and it sounds like, you know, a great translation over to this world. I saw a hand over here too.
I did my graduate thesis. I did some research. I utilized a focus group and some qualitative methodology for studying an issue around lay leadership in the Catholic Church.
And I thought somebody started to raise a hand over here. No? You did?
I'm not sure if I rose my hand or not, but
you might have just been eating.
As part of Master's in Organizational Leadership, did a research project kind of similar to what you were saying, in terms of involving focus groups about how could you assess organizational resiliency as opposed to individual resiliency.
Okay, everybody heard that, organizational resiliency, and because all hands are coming up, and I think you were trying to jump in too, and then we'll go around.
I did undergraduate research as a McNair scholar on compositional diversity in higher education.
Compositional diversity, what is that?
So that is like how your student body is composed, the diversity and the correlation to the faculty, staff, and administrative.
Great. First I thought composition like in English, like writing something.
No, that's not my thing.
No, not that. Okay.
No. I'm in the early stages, but I'm in a doctorate of ministry, working on a proposal for a research project that will hopefully look at the efficacy of my spirituality groups on my dual diagnosis unit here. But I'm still in the...
You're in the hopeful stage.
Yeah, right in the hopeful stage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a master's in educational administration, and 10 years ago. My thesis paper was on the achievement gap with students of color in Minneapolis public schools, and I did research on other school districts outside of Minnesota and how they were able to close the gap and what were the reasons and ways that they were able to do that. So, yeah.
I also did a focus group study on for nurses and paraprofessionals regarding what we were calling then compassion fatigue, but I found the learnings to be revolutionary and scary and got me activated. But another one I was involved in was as a team from the Center for Spirituality and Healing that was part of the George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Health, academic medical health centers from around the country. And it was very disappointing in terms of our team's ability to construct the project and gather data that was meaningful.
So there's a huge gulf between coming up with a great question and coming up with a meaningful product. Yeah. Yes.
Not a lot of experience personally with research, but I was a chaplain resident when it was still a University of Minnesota Hospital and Clinic 22 years ago, and Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer helped us out with basically this task of kind of literacy around research. And each of us did a review of the literature on a particular topic. And I did one on music therapy's connection with spiritual care. But my main experience of research of learning is more by osmosis of just being a proofreader for anything my spouse has written in nursing research, so So I've read a lot and all the qualitative therapy.
In a way, you might almost call that vicarious research. You didn't exactly carry out the study, but you're in that study when you're reading. And yeah.
These are some of my words as a proofreader or editor.
Absolutely. Obviously, research is a multifaceted undertaking. Yeah, Mike.
Many years ago, I was part of a research group that looked at Houston hospitals in Texas that looked at the delayed time between when somebody is admitted to when they have surgery. What happens and why that is from admission to what we called cut time, and look at ways in which we could address that. Do what?
Cut time?
That's what they called it.
The time when they cut in?
That's exactly what it means. There's doors in and then there's cut time. There's two very different things. If you show up for one, you may be late for the other.
Yeah, I was part of a research team that did a qualitative study based on interviews of clinical pastoral educators who were going to certification. And the reason I mention it is because I was part of the coding team, so that was the first time I had ever actually created the coding for the study. So that was a new piece for me. Yeah, and it was published in the Journal of Supervision.
Wonderful. Just some amazing experiences around the group. I'm hearing quantitative, qualitative, analyses of individuals versus systems, and across a lot of different topics, including a baseball team. Teams are teams, aren't they, Simon? So I think these experiences, and even those of you that haven't raised your hand to say you did something specific, that you've been living your lives, and your lived experience is what you're going to bring to understanding and evaluating research. And so I really feel like, especially the workshops, at least that I'm giving, I believe that they're pointing you in the direction of things you already know. There isn't anything here that is earth-shattering and like, where did that idea come from? You already know these things, and so that, to me, that's the big news. The other thing that I wanted to do is give you kind of a quick rundown of what we'll be spending the rest of today's time with, as well as a little more of an overview of the 8 workshop series that this grant was funded. For today, essentially, again, briefly introducing the curriculum. In our conversation, I think that it will be apparent how the critical reflection model of CPE intersects and overlaps with this notion of research literacy and evidence-based practice. And then also spend some time talking about the importance of evidence-based work in both practice, in your practice, in your profession. This is just a quick look at the agenda. We may stick to this, we may not, but I feel confident that we will have touched upon everything in one way or another. And I never worry about whether I get through all of my slides, because it's usually my experience that you will be about 7 slides ahead of me, and you will have said it anyway. So no sense to feel rushed. Please feel free to comment and interject as you wish. Now, the actual curriculum that runs from today till a date in June is a series of 8 workshops. I will be doing the first and third one, and then the last 2. The other ones, the next one coming up will be by Mars. I apologize, I don't know people's first names. That I think will be around how to access and locate literature that's of meaning and importance to you. The 4th and 5th workshops will be introductions and overviews to qualitative and quantitative research. And I know those of you who've mentioned being involved in those kinds of studies will be able to really connect what you did to what you're hearing from Paula Forte, who's doing those workshops. This is a staff person here.
Paul Galschuch.
Paul, sounds fabulous. The intersection of research and presence. And I actually personally am hoping I can come to those workshops. I really want to hear that one. And then a few other assorted topics. The workshops are a 2-hour block, with the opening part of it being lunch and kind of catching up with your colleagues here a little bit and getting yourselves organized. And then the idea is approximately about 1+ hours of content with about 30 minutes of discussion. I don't know how the other presenters are planning to proceed, but I'm not a straight lecture type person in the way that I work. I'm intending to interweave a discussion along with content that I have on my slides. So that's the plan. With that said, I'm going to start by asking you to do something rather than me. Just by a person or persons beside you, I'm not sure if we have an even or odd number in here, but at least with one other partner, would you spend a couple of minutes just talking about what you think of when you hear the term research?
I think if we were studying the basics.
That's the first one that was coming up statistics class, I was I like it. You can't go at all?
And that's what I always associated with research. The one research project I did.
How do you go without manipulation?
There's this thing that I've never done.
But I think of it as like no.
So skepticism,
Especially it depends on who operates like Gallup and others, and sometimes there's other organizations that use research as a way to do what they want to do.
speaking on the same topic and saying the exact opposite.
I think of deep study,
Mostly, I never engaged in this kind of research.
The part that I have a lot of fun at the Harvard questions and the methods that you're not the right way to work on, how they develop the research and suffer. especially for doing surveys. So what is how do I ask this question, and what options do I give people in the way that they respond? And that balance between like skills and open-ended, what is the right mixture to give people a learning?
I meant to tell you, I brought my prayer bowl for my students years ago because they were tired of hearing me yell time. So I'll use this to call you back to order if you don't mind. Why don't we go around, and I'd be interested in hearing from each pairing one thing that you discussed in terms of what you think about when you hear the term research. And we'll just kind of go around until we've exhausted all the unique ideas. Okay? So I'll go the other direction since I started with you before. How about one thing that the group here came up with?
You're all looking at me. I liked what Cheryl kind of was talking about, we all were, that there's a question or there's an answer you're seeking. So that question of the research, what is it that's being inquired about?
All right, so there's a reason for research is that there's an identified question, something that you'd like to know something about. And we'll spend a little time in the third workshop on just saying a bit more about what the research questions might be, but okay. How about the next pairing?
We talked about how it's a powerful word, especially in a healthcare institution when someone says that, say, a procedure is research-based, that is powerful both to those of us on the team who hear that. We hear that as being evidence-based. But it's also powerful to patients. And we talked about that too, that a patient can hear that a procedure is well-researched, and that gives it credibility.
So that idea of power or credibility, and it almost seems to me like it's perhaps at times given more value or weight than other ways of knowing.
Absolutely.
And I don't know about all of you, but when you said that, I immediately thought too, and especially in my early days, but even now sometimes the concept of research is scary. It's intimidating. I don't know. You see a few head nods here, so I got a couple of people agreeing with me. So somehow it does become this thing unto itself that doesn't feel perhaps natural or comfortable, but powerful. But the next grouping was it 2 people? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, 3, 4, whatever.
We talked about a few different things. I'm trying to find the consensus of what but we talked about both the excitement of just the vicarious research, I think you said earlier, reading and enjoying it, and being a part of research projects. But then sort of the uncomfortability or lack of awareness around the actual procedures of it and the scientific pieces of it. And that balance between really scientific and set in stone research findings and the fluid research findings that sort of like, well, this research proved this. And then a week later, a different one proved something completely opposite.
like what
you snuck several good points, and let's see if I can summarize those. And I'm not sure I can, so you may have to help me out, but I'll work backwards.
I don't know if I did.
Maybe your partners can help you there. The notion that research sometimes carries with it this notion of set in stone or like it's the truth. And as opposed to the idea that perhaps knowing is very fluid and being careful about giving too much power to what is being generated by research. But then what else did you say? Because it was really good and I'm losing the thread.
The first part was part of just the excitement around research. Like the hopeful stage I'm currently in with my research, to reading research and loving it, being a part of the interviewing processes, and then you get down to the stats piece and it's like, no, I'm good.
Well, as in all activities, there's some things we were really thrilled about and then other things that just are a necessary part of what we have to do. And I think you're talking about the fact that for a lot of people, right, what lights you up are those questions and figuring out a way to try to address them. And then clearly, if your research involves people, I'm assuming you're in this profession because you have an interest in people. And so it's wonderful to be able to keep connecting in a different way. also, when you said that about exciting, I was thinking about the fact that I often say to my students that when you get those findings, it's like opening presents on your birthday or at a holiday. You can't wait to see what's inside. You know, it really is exciting. There's never, I always laugh when somebody goes, what if I don't find anything? And the answer is you'll always find something. Always. You just kind of have to figure out what it is when you open the box. And then I think you also made another point that it's maybe that feeling of you can really appreciate and be interested in and excited about something, but not feel like you necessarily have the training to be able to do the research. So I was thinking in my head like, so we might value surgery, but I don't know if anybody in here would be comfortable practicing it. But that doesn't mean you can't appreciate what goes into that activity. About the next grouping.
Well, I think we had a couple ideas. It's just a deep study of the topic or topics to further get the answer. It's a vigorous. You said it best. Why don't you?
Well, I just talked about, I think of rigor and accountability. You know,
Yeah.
rigorous attention and accountability for what is gathered and what is deduced.
Okay. And it almost sounds like really paying careful attention, not just sort of improvising. Somehow it's a little different than that. And when you said deep, how are you thinking about deep?
I think you get in the nitty-gritty of things. I mean, if you're trying to find an answer to something, you've got to take all the variables and really research each one inside and out to get to that answer. And because I'm sure you're going to find things, I believe was pointed out, that aren't going to go the way you want to. Oh, we talked about that. You want it to go a certain way. Is that what we're talking about? It doesn't go the way you want it to? We didn't talk about that, did we?
In your mind, you did.
So, I mean, that's what I mean, a deep study. I mean, you study something, but I think with research, you really have to study at like 100 levels deeper to get a foundational, I don't know. That's just that was my actually bringing to our group discussion.
Yeah.
But Judy, I thought had it clear.
Well, and it's wonderful, and to me that is aspirational research. Because the truth is, I always think of something that a program evaluation faculty member said over in the department I used to work in. They said there's good, quick, and cheap when it comes to research. You can have 2 of the 3, but never all 3. And why I say that and what I was thinking about is what you described aspirationally. I'm thinking, how many centuries would it take to be able to deeply look at every possible variable to figure it out? And so, to me, it's always the reminder that what we want to answer doesn't come in one study. It may not even come in 20 studies. It may not come in 50 studies. And that sometimes it's very disappointing when you come up with this fabulous question, and then by the time you get down to a more tightly controlled investigation, it's like, geez, you kind of lost the forest for the tree, and really the splinter in the tree that you're studying. But when people persist and do additional studies, and different people contribute to that body of literature, those answers do start to emerge. They just can't all be good, quick, and cheap. How about the diet back here?
Michael talked about evidence, research. A word that comes to mind is evidence. It's evidence-based. The word that came to mind for me was data. Lots of inputs, and trying to come out with, well, what's the result of all these inputs and variables.
Okay, so sort of that product or that outcome from a particular investigation, evidence, data. Okay. What's next?
So one of the unique things that we could contribute to the conversation is the importance of framing the question right to get the answer one is seeking. Bad question, bad answer. Good question, good answer. But how do you frame it so that you get what you're really looking for?
Absolutely. That pre-work is so important. Again, research is just the tool for something you want to know about. And I always remember a line in a counseling skills book that I read, and I think it applies to research as well. In the book, it was about the kind of questions that you ask your clients or patients. And it said a good answer to the wrong question is not an answer. And so I think that's what you were really getting at. But yeah,
I was going to say the other thing we talked about too, or shared with Nick, was a lot of skepticism. Is where I come from, because I've seen so much research manipulate,
Ah.
especially in corporate environments where it's not Gallup or it's not a neutral party. But my background's public relations, so
So you know.
sorry, reshaping the truth for a better tomorrow. And I've seen a lot of research used as a way to try to project what you really hope it says, and manipulating information and data, and yeah.
My favorite book as an undergraduate in my statistics course was How to Lie with Statistics. And it's really speaking to the fact bias. And you know, to me, at a higher philosophical level, I mean, clearly none of us are free of bias. I think about in perceptual psychology, you know, professors who would say, you can't know what you can't see because you can't see it. At the same time, in research, trying to at least recognize what your biases might be, putting those out there so that other people could evaluate and say, well, of course you got that, that's exactly what you expected, as opposed to, well, no, maybe this really does have some credibility. It isn't so affected by bias, but you can't get away with it, but you have to try to minimize it. But the next thing.
I think if I were to recall conversation, I might pull in on the word of depth that was used over here. We kind of touched on that, where research gets at things under the surface. Helps you understand what you're doing better and why. It really informs what you're doing when you dig into that.
Okay.
And we, of course, mentioned just, you know, the data, the details, the numbers. That's a part of it.
I find often when research comes to my mind, it's an opportunity to take a step back in terms of kind of we swim in a lot of data, and reading research can help make sense of it.
And you know, as you said that, I immediately thought about the fact that when we're engaged in practice, if we're simply moving to the next thing, the next thing, and the next thing, and can't sit back and be self-reflective, self-reflective practice, how do we really then grow, develop, enhance what we're doing? Research can be an activity that encourages that self-reflective practice.
Yeah. The big thought also that takes you to the thoughtful judgment and decision making.
Yes.
Than the regular.
Yes. You know, I think you really are getting at something there about it moves things beyond trial and error. It moves things beyond a mere because I said so. It really moves things to reasons, that evidence, that data, to say, this seems to make sense. It isn't just personal opinion or whim. About the next, Harry.
I actually didn't use this word in our discussion, but I think the word humility at its best and openness describes good research models as opposed to ideology, and I should use a qualifier because ideology just isn't good or bad, but as opposed to fixed or unmovable ideology, I think, which we see so much of today, and in kind of a strong anti-science bent that's out there with a lot of people. I some of the most spiritual writings I've read in the last couple of years are by physicists, you know, about just the openness and wonderment at that what. If we could know reality in its totality, and these researchers are saying we really can't, we can only know that little picture of them, but it's so amazing and beautiful that anybody who would say they know the truth, so I'm very suspicious of anybody who gives, and that's so humility and openness.
This is great. And you know, these things that you're identifying, these are the kinds of things to have in mind when you're consuming research, when you're reading the literature. This isn't about, I mean, of course it is about doing research, but it's also about how you're evaluating what you pick up to read. All of these factors really are kind of the ingredients that either are there or absent from the work. And I really like what you said, and I was thinking as you said that about the glimpses of reality. To me, I think every study is like a snapshot. Okay, you don't have the whole album, but you've got snapshots that you can try to create a narrative of reality from. And I think you're absolutely right about humility. One thing I also thought of, as you said that, to be watchful or mindful of when you do read things that are research, is sometimes the enthusiasm of the researchers to way overreach what they actually have in the way of evidence or data. I think it's well-intentioned, but it doesn't always help when people go from, we found, you know, a very, very small statistically significant differences, and that means we need to throw out the entire model of practice and do something else. That's sort of that, yeah, they know the truth, but they don't really. And how about our last dyad here?
Well, we actually talked a little bit, I share a little bit of my experience with my mother-in-law who has Parkinson's, and she's the first one in her family to have it. So there were 2 opportunities for studies which we said yes to, and I'm more aware now of what it means to be a participant. By saying yes, I mean multiple surveys over months and time, and now that she's not able to do it, we're the ones doing it. And I also have like a box for data collection on my desk that has never gotten to her place, because we all know it's going to take something to get that data collected. And so it takes a lot to actually have people participate through the course of research to get the conclusions that you're hoping for.
Yeah.
So I'm just more aware of what it means for someone to say yes to being a part of a study.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah. That is so important, and I have 2 thoughts as you were speaking. If someone has any awareness they're part of a study, they are also part of an intervention. Being in a study has an effect on the people in the study. By the way, it has an impact on us as researchers too, but I think sometimes we have a little more maybe recognition or awareness of what that impact might be on us, but it clearly does. You said all the paperwork, but I was thinking even just of the emotions that are probably being generated from whatever those forms are that are being completed. And I think, again, that says to me that really good research has somebody involved in the study who has not lost touch with the population that they're studying. So again, people in practice have a better sense of, are you asking too much or not enough? Conversely, I think too, this speaks to when you pick up a paper and think, why didn't they also ask this, 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 and this? That there may be very practical reasons why you can't overload participants to do this, 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 and that. So we're back again to that idea that aspirationally, we'd figure out the answer, but in reality, we're really on a journey of baby steps.
That brought up a memory for me. I belonged to the religious community out of which the original nun study was done, where elderly sisters were asked if they would like to donate their brain after they died, and then assessed over months and years ahead of that, and then they went back and examined their writings from when they were like 16, 17, 18 years of age and all that. And what I saw happening among some of the sisters who had enrolled in the study, their impressions of being treated like children. So these are people who are aging and who have a lot of concerns about being treated like they're losing their memory or losing their mind or whatever. And so what I'm realizing is there's a lot of interpersonal complexity that gets into the equation, because some of their fears of what it meant to be asked these questions and asked to walk that line and whatever, it felt dangerous to them, or they felt vulnerable. And some of them dropped out of the study. So I thought, I wonder how, you know, how that becomes a factor.
You lose people when you don't treat them well. And something that you would look for in a paper is, well, gee, they started with 500 people and they're down to like 200 within 6 months. And unless it's a population where there's health and death and dying issues, and that's why they can't be in the study, you really kind of have to look at what's something going on there. And you're right. And then just think about, I was just trying to imagine how accurate were the data if you had participants in a highly distressed state participating in the study. To me, it also speaks to something that I think has been great as research moves along in human services fields, at least, that it's much more a team approach and not one person trying to do it all. It kind of goes back to, you're loving the topic and you're scared of the statistics, well then you get a statistician who's great at that, you know, but they're not so great at generating the topic, right? So you get a team of people, and that also then helps with some of these unintended things that are going on that then affect. And really, what a shame, what a fabulous idea, but the data probably were compromised. So everybody had a chance to contribute a couple ideas, but let me see if there's anything that wasn't said that anybody would like to add in on this question of what comes to mind when you think of research.
I'm thinking of the very careful balance between what you offered of not treating maybe the people researching like with the most care, but then you don't want to treat them like too well. I'm thinking of my friend specifically. She's doing research in global health, and they were trying to figure out the exact amount of money to like pay each person for their research, because if it was too much, like, so someone like myself with a master's degree, I could accept maybe a little more money than someone maybe with like a lesser degree, but depending how much money you receive, if it's way outside the scope of what you normally receive, that could be considered coercion, and you'd be willing to compromise like your family, like maybe some of your ethics and different things around that for the sake of the study. And so I'm thinking like, how do researchers like measure that and figure out that fine line between like coercion, but then also like I am willingly doing this and not having this biasness in me. And
your institutional review board has a spot for you on the committee, because that is absolutely an important issue. And you know, in reading articles, look for if they are data-based, whether there's a statement about having received approval or being evaluated as exempt from approval for doing the particular study for these kinds of reasons. That is huge. And you can't take a cookbook approach and say, well, for so many minutes of input, this is how much money someone gets or what kind of gift card they get, because you're absolutely right. A $10 gift card to someone with limited means is a huge incentive versus someone who's much more financially perhaps stable and not worth their time. So that is something that institutional review boards are very careful about, that you don't want to be coercing people in by paying them. It really is more, did you try to in some way give an honorarium or compensate a bit for their time and involvement? Yeah. So great thinking you're doing there. Anything else anybody would like to add about the research?
I just kind of connect to that. It's brought up, I remember I lived in Central America for about 4 years, and a lot of research was being done, especially by the local national university and Jesuit university, and there was always that struggle of, in the communities, public health type research, like a mistrust of these people are coming in, middle to upper class, who's benefiting, are they just making money off of us, are they going to stick around when it gets really rough? So there was all, and so I think a lot of the work, and I think that the two institutions I mentioned did a pretty good job of making sure that they were rooted in the community and not just kind of helicoptering in and going out. So that was an issue about who benefits, are they using these to just further their careers, so those kind of, that mistrust.
That is huge, and it's a very real issue, and I think that it has never been resolved completely for researchers in all kinds of fields, but it is really important that you do whatever you can, or the researchers that you're reading have attempted to say, what's the benefit in the longer run to people or people like the individuals being in a study? Because there has been too much of swoop in, and often I think it's because it's grant-funded kind of research, and here we go, and we're going to set up this great clinic. Then the money runs out, and it's like, well, see you later. And I totally get that people feel resentful and used for that. You know, you got what you wanted, now you're gone. Well, great, no, what about us? And so there is a lot more of an attempt to try to have long-lasting effects as much as possible, especially when you're doing community-based research. you know, with real people with real lives. Absolutely. That's really different than something like M-Turk. Anybody heard of that, Mechanical Turk? Benefits, I've got a college-age daughter. She told me about it. You go online and you do these surveys for like about 35 cents a piece. I said, well, how much have you? And she said, oh, about $48. I said, how many of those have you done? She said, oh, about 200. It's this online thing where they tell you exactly how much time it's going to take. They pay you a little bit amount of money. You do it or you don't. But she's just having a blast filling out all these surveys. But that's very different than community-based research where people have a need. Her need is, you know, to buy enough to go to Starbucks. That's really different. So glad you brought that piece up. And it does sometimes, I think, create that rift. There again is where, when research is a team approach, where you have practitioners on that team, the public may be more accepting because they know you and they trust you. And they know that you're not going to leave when things are over. Excellent. But of course, I have to put up a formal definition of research, but you will see you nailed it and then some. That out of the Oxford Dictionary basically says, research is a systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. I would put facts in quotes a bit because, you know, today's fact is tomorrow's fallacy. The synonyms I really like, though, and you'll see different terms used in different papers. Investigation, experimentation, testing, exploration, analysis, fact-finding, examination, scrutiny, scrutinization, and probing. And at the workshop yesterday, someone said they would like to add observing up there to also give maybe a bit of a call to the idea that sometimes research is done and people don't even know it's going on. Back in the day, I had a course in unobtrusive measures in the social sciences, and I always remember one of the examples from the textbook. This museum figured out the most popular exhibit for kids by figuring out the height of the fingerprints on the house. Nobody knew they were in a study, but it was like a great piece of data, right? So there are things, I mean, that you could be doing where you don't even need permission because it's public information. All right, another couple minutes or so for you to talk with one or two people beside you. Given that evidence-based research talks a lot about outcome, what do you think of? How do you define the term outcome in chaplaincy? And what kind of outcomes come to your mind? And we'll see.
You'll have to join our
Like back to one of our first meetings that we did spoke about that one color and talk about more like expectation that spiritual advisor will be lower to provide some sort of so I think about
kind of thinking like
sort of chaplaincy outcome would be
clients would be unanimous surveys and ask a bunch of questions about us as representatives and supposedly
Is that in the airport?
No, this is like, there's a lot of sales organizations, a lot of companies.
And it's physical, it's hard to
measure.
It is.
I wonder if
That was like the reading that basically,
yeah, it's like trying to visualize
yeah, there's so much of this where
right. While it was exciting, because I'm like, okay, we'll have these it's also disheartening because I'm like, why do I ever feel like I'm fighting over my job? The research is important.
Yeah, it's a word, real life. Yeah.
Is that the outcome? I mean, that might rate higher, but is that the outcome?
And is the outcome, how many patients can you see? And is the outcome quantitative?
I think the chaplaincy outcome is harder.
It is.
It's about how do I help this person?
Theoretically, again, ethically, I'm like, theoretically,
Make meaning of this situation. So that's a pretty soft, subjective outcome. Someone else may look at chaplaincy and say, how do chaplaincy affect the stay in the hospital or the person's comfort?
So, but as I was reading,
It
is, because there's no solid, like, you take blood pressure and say, oh, well, your protein levels or whatever. Give you that.
The data is not even dealing with someone's brain, we're dealing with someone's use of something.
It's almost the same.
There are all kinds of
There's so much of it that we don't know. Word of song. Rap. Some of the stuff we do. That's the difficult.
There are metrics. The difficulty is getting out of, for example, we have at Bethel a team that are academic advisors. That team leader uses metrics to determine outcomes and to manage the manpower, all kinds of things. What is that advising? Our new right program. What do you need to be taking next term? Are you having any troubles in school? How can we help you? Some of that's objective, like what courses do I need to take and when do I need to register? And part of that's subjective. How am I doing? How am I feeling? Am I in the right place? So, what are the metrics?
There were studies.
The metrics, student persistence, where you can measure that.
So there's, who gets
That's the hard question. It's not like down the airline using research on how to airplane. How many butts and seats, and what's the frequency, how many butts and seats, and how much that you can do. They don't care about what's comfortable. The butts have another
Determining metrics then become
sorry to have to stop the lively conversation. I kept waiting for it to like diminish it. But it wasn't. Not with this group. Not with this group, that's right. Well, let's see, I need to start this way because the other way first. So again, let's go around and I'd be curious. Let's start with just the definition of outcome before we actually go to outcomes in chaplaincy. And maybe one piece of how to define it. One idea.
We didn't get to a full definition.
That's okay.
Hard, fast data.
You think an outcome is hard, fast data, okay? All right.
Results hoped for.
Results hoped for. Okay.
And then we talk more about, how would they say it? Who wants what?
Oh, the outcome is who wants what, and you hope that it's what you were wanting to get, and it's hard, fast data, which sort of sounds like it's compelling, seems credible, seems accurate. Okay.
The goal that you set up, whether you reach or not.
Okay. So it's really something you're trying to accomplish, the goal that you set? Okay.
For me, the outcome was the effect of my engagement with the patient.
Okay. So it's the effect of something that's occurring before that something happens. Okay.
I think you had a couple. End result or what was it you just said?
Oh, I was saying like a result credibly linked to some input for intervention.
Okay, so end result that you hopefully can link to the reason for that result rather than just going, well, I wonder why that happened. Okay.
Think of it as the consequence.
Consequence?
So not necessarily like it could be connected to what you did, it could not. Like correlation isn't causation, like it's just what happened. Like the end result, the consequence.
So you raise a good point that just precisely focused on outcome, it's something that happened without any necessarily connection to the how or the why or what. Yeah, okay. Yeah? Anything else anybody wants to add just to the general definition?
Well, maybe we've said this, but for me, it's like what the evidence points to. Again, not what you, because if you ask the question openly, the outcome is what the study, what the research actually points to, is the outcome of the research, isn't it? Am I thinking of this?
Well, I think you're getting at a distinction between types of research that are more exploratory to say, let's just see what is, as opposed to studies where maybe it's let's try to make something happen and see if we can.
Produce an outcome.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
But it's
Okay.
outcomes either way, but it's different, I think, in terms of where it arises from.
Yeah.
Anything else anybody wants to add to the definition?
We were talking about outcomes that are a result of, chaplain interaction, like reduced anxiety or reduced pain.
Yeah.
But it depends on it, and you could do it either through our observation or the patient reporting. And those are two different ways to measure the outcome.
Okay. And so and this is great, you're sort of segueing to outcomes specific to chaplaincy, and you're raising the question of an outcome as determined by whom. And there's always different perspectives. And I know we've seen in the psychology world for years, when you try to do observational work on therapeutic interactions, and you look at things like empathy, what the client says about the counselor's empathy versus what the counselor thought their empathy was versus an external judge does not have perfect agreement. So much for those hard, fast facts that you want. They're only hard and fast if you limit to one particular viewpoint. Yeah. Wow. So a really good thing to be looking for in papers, in literature, is who is providing the evidence, and perhaps also, do they have a vested interest in a certain outcome? I always think about how quickly the media and everybody debunked the idea that when cigarette companies are funding research and coming up with the finding that cigarettes don't cause cancer, well, consider the source. So, you really have to kind of watch for that sort of thing. Now, another thing to be kind of paying attention to if you are skeptical about something you're reading is that often journals require a conflict of interest statement at the end or somewhere in the body of the paper, identifying what the potential conflict is or saying there is no conflict, and that helps somewhat. But I mean, let's face it, even beyond that, I think we all have our way that we think the world is, and so we probably all have a conflict of interest to a certain extent, but acknowledge the best you can. So let me show you the definition, and then I want to get to some of those chaplaincy outcomes if we have time to talk about that. You could have, again, written the definition. The way a thing turns out, a consequence. I feel like we're playing a match game. Here we go. But the only thing nobody said was outgrowth or development, but we are shoot the other ones. So just purely in and of itself, it's what happens. Now, in terms of what happens as a result of chaplaincy services, what kinds of outcomes did you speculate or brainstorm about? And we don't have to go around, I'll just ask anybody randomly.
Relieving distress.
Relieving distress. In whom?
The patient.
The patient, okay.
Could be staff.
Could be staff,
Or family.
Yeah, family.
Or self, yeah.
Could be clarification of goals.
Right.
Clarification of the goals of care for your profession, or for your setting,
I'm
or
thinking of the patient and their
for a
family.
specific patient. Okay,
And
now
that's a
think
team approach. I mean,
Yes.
a lot of people are involved.
Yes. Okay, and actually, as I thought of that, I could see that as being very precise, individualized, customized goals, but all the way up to research that looks at general types of goals that are more or less universal across a specific setting. A great example someone gave me yesterday was the distinction between goals of care for post-surgery versus palliative.
Yeah.
And does somebody else have a hand? I'm sorry. Did you get a chance, Jean? You did.
No, we talked a little bit about maybe not so specifically the outcome of, like, I mean, of course, we mentioned decreased anxiety. But one thought that came to us too was just connecting it with that charting method that we've often used, data intervention outcome. And I forget what the P is off the top of my head. Plan, thank you. Yeah. And how that's such an integral part of our work is paying attention to what happened because I sat with that patient. That we're kind of wired already to be looking for that.
And you know, what you just said to me suggests then a whole other complexity around outcome. What happened when I sat with that patient? Because I got to thinking, and I know we discussed this yesterday, is the goal always decreased anxiety?
No.
And so one of the beware ofs around evidence-based practice is getting into these cookbook sort of ideas from whoever above you perhaps is driving the car on this, that decreased anxiety isn't always appropriate. So I'm glad you said that. And then lots of hands, everybody jump in.
I was just going to say, I brought up some of the work myself and some colleagues have been trying to do around figuring out outcomes in behavioral health and how some med-surg interventions might be inappropriate or produce inappropriate outcomes in behavioral health settings, and trying to figure out or even locate any sort of writings around chaplaincy outcomes in behavioral health is very scarce at this point.
Well, you know, and also from the literature that I've been reading in the chaplaincy literature or journals, the amount of what's called empirical research is rather small. It's growing, but it hasn't been something that's been part of chaplaincy from its origins to today. So I'm not surprised. You'll probably find more gaps than you will an abundance of studies. Also, as you said that, though, I thought of another thing I always try to have in mind as well, too, is the political, how politically charged certain things are. I right away thought, I'll bet you don't have a physician in your group, or if you do, you could really be bucking a system that might be resistant to hearing, that the way they proceed is not the way to go. So having to be mindful of the political ramifications that not only make research difficult, but also make the interpretation maybe questionable.
One thing I think of for a patient outcome would be reappraisal of their sources of meaning in order to use them for better coping.
Okay. So reappraisal of the patient's sources of meaning, and then making use of those to try to facilitate coping?
For them to be able to cope better,
And not knowing what your particular setting is and how many interactions you feasibly can have with someone, that might be the goal or the outcome, or it could even be assessing the resources. And you may not have the time and to go that next step. So I think that's another thing to realize about outcomes is there's small steps toward the ultimate outcome, and one study may not be able to do it all. How about other outcomes? Yeah.
And this is a wandering I'm having right now with the conversation. If it's out of place, let me know. But and I don't know the answer being new here. With the amount of data that we enter into Epic when we're charting, and there are a lot of pre-described boxes, are we using any of that as outcome? Is any of that data being collected, gathered? Can you sort it, split it, do other things to look at that for chaplaincy? I don't know.
Well, the answer is yes. For chaplaincy, I can't speak specifically. I know that I have seen in a couple of the papers I read, electronic medical record is a source of evidence. The quality and quantity or nature of that evidence may or may not fit depending on what your question is. The minute I hear that things are in pre-autofilled boxes, I think that that's going to lose the nuance. And so ideally in research you can have more than one source of evidence to try to more fully capture what it is you're trying to study. But yeah, people are attempting to look at that, and there it is. There's your data sitting, just waiting for someone to cull it.
One of the things that we have thought about when structuring some of the ways we use the electronic medical record was to give us access to data in the future. However, we would still have to do some pretty rigorous work around agreeing what are the criteria all of us use for choosing this box versus that box, this title, whatever, because it's meaningless without some sort of,
So the minute you pick up a paper and it says, we had 12 different people identifying this variable out of the electronic medical record, I better hope to see what they did to train the people to get their inner rater reliability as close to perfect as you could. There you go. Well, and I thought you were going to go the other route. Maybe it's a little better with electronic medical record than in the hand charting, but practitioners don't do the same thing consistently, and they certainly aren't consistent across themselves. So you get into what looks like 1,000 patient records, and you can't find, 200 where there's agreement or where there's sufficient data. So you have to do some inspecting of that evidence to see if it's going to be useful for your question.
We were kind of turning the wheel a little bit around the vantage point of the outcome, whether it's patient-based or family-based or staff, but then also looking at the facility itself, like how is this looking at the outcomes for the facility, like reducing length of stay, or this or that. Then the outcome is looking more from the institution, and then I was even thinking about chaplain. What kind of studies are we doing that actually improve the work of chaplains? Like if we use this charting method, we save 2 hours per week, or and we don't tend to, I think, often look that direction as much as we look toward the patient.
You've identified like a whole plethora there of possible outcomes. You're absolutely right. I mean, almost anything you could think of could be a great research question to investigate. And I will make the statement that any question, there's a way to study it. So, not to be off-put by something that looks like that'd be really hard to do or we couldn't do it, there's always some way. But you are right, and there's room for all that kind of research. And I guess the question is, when you're going into the literature, what are you most wanting to know so that you refine your search to the kind of outcome you're interested in? And if it's the institution's desired outcomes, that's really different than what the patients are saying that they want. And different than maybe what the providers are believing that they should be achieving. So I think we're back full circle to it. All depends on whose perspective and whose outcomes.
So I'm just getting how political. It's just hitting how political this is, like who gets to say. And I'm feeling it in my body, it just feels like a tension.
In some ways, depending on how you're using the term politics, there's no way to get away from it in any field. Think about students who generate a lot of the research in a lot of our fields. They better be doing what their advisor is comfortable with. They better be doing what's consistent with the philosophy or orientation of their program. An example, actually, we just came into over at the U was an undergraduate who's interested in going on to graduate school in genetic counseling and got connected with a faculty member in another department and wanted to go and look at genetic counselors' bias around issues of disability. Well, the thing is, the entire ethical code of that profession is around autonomy and patient choice. And we said to this person, you do that, and graduate programs see what you're doing research on, and they may misunderstand and think you're on a mission to say that a group of professionals that don't view themselves as biased are biased, political. So she kind of dropped the idea and went with something else. So you really have to kind of know, do you have the resources and the strength to buck whatever the political issue might be? But there's probably no study that's completely politically free.
So, I shared with my group with everyone. A couple of years ago, I heard a comment at a palliative conference here by one of our really revered medical directors of an adult ICU who was speaking on end-of-life decisions, and just shows how complex it is to say that a certain outcome is good or bad, or because he said, sort of tongue-in-cheek, he said that he knew that he was kind of notorious for his very high mortality rate under his watch on the ICU. And he said, and he's revered by staff, patients, families, great guy. And so he said, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. How did you take?
Well, I knew him. I knew he was talking about that because I know this is a doctor that is very good at, if a family conference has not been asked for by social work or nursing, or he will take initiative to make sure that everybody's on board and hearing each other and talking and really deeply listening to the patient or the proxy. And so on ICU, when that happens, it often the best outcome is withdrawal of fetal care. And so you end up with a very high mortality rate. And he said that doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad physician.
That means that you respected the patients. Right. Yeah. Wow. And you know, I say in my counseling classes, but I think of it in research as well, that I don't know why after all these years I'm continually surprised when people think in a different way or would do something different than what I would do. But of course they do, because we're all very, very different. And so to me, that's a reminder about when people are reporting data, that they are careful not to put a tone on it that isn't there. Right. Unless the participants were the patients and said this was a good outcome or a bad outcome, right. That word has no place, I think, in the interpretation. And truly, in research, collecting the data is pretty easy. Interpreting it is the really hard part. And always in reading a paper, I will try to think of, are there additional explanations? And I will look at a paper when people are trying to make sense of what they found, that they give at least 2 different ideas about it, not just one, because we don't really know what the findings fully mean. So that was a great example. Thank you for that.
Well, isn't a lot of this discussion is also about the viability of outcomes. Yes. And this is what I mean by that, of that outcomes I might perceive, or any one person in this room might perceive as being valuable. But does it have value to the institution on a dollars and cents level? And that's what this is all about, because we know we're in a vulnerable profession of needing to prove value to an institution with at least be in that question. And not that an institution always places money at the top value by any means, but it just becomes an interesting piece of the puzzle when maybe some of us don't place a monetary value on what we do. And we live in a culture that often does. And how will we do with that?
That's an excellent point, and that is one of the challenges about research in the profession of chaplaincy. Exactly what you just said. You know, different people have whatever lens they have to look through, to think and to see who you are and what you do. And so you're absolutely right that the people who control money, people who control the decisions around policy, oftentimes the economic piece is the only piece that maybe that's the strongest lens they have when they're looking. And so maybe part of the research imperative is around explaining who you are, what you do, explaining how other kinds of outcomes contribute to that cost effectiveness, if that seems to be the primary outcome they're interested in, and that you're continually, part of research is continually justifying your existence in the world that you're working in. I think everybody says, and I hope they really mean it, that ultimately it's the patient experience and the patient care that is the central outcome that everyone agrees on. But the ideas about how you care for patients, that's where the distinctions come.
Well, if I may be so crass, it's still dollars and cents in this country about health care and the sustainability of health care and who is going to be cut and who will stay just because there's not enough to go around within the context that it is being used.
So then that strikes me that part of research is almost in a way garnering support from people that the administrators will listen to. And to me, that's the patients and their families. And patients and families are seeing that there's a benefit to a professional who's caring for them. That will carry weight because those patients and families will go elsewhere, and then the whole thing topples, is the way I think about that. And I think it's also, though, trying and having to be very creative and clever about the way you do go about studying your work. Two great examples I heard yesterday. One person talked about a study where somebody stood outside patient rooms and with a stopwatch clocked the amount of time the chaplain spent in the room. And then, and I think they came up with like an average of 13 minutes. And they said, now if you could connect that to something like, the easiest thing would be patient satisfaction, and we could get into a whole conversation about the pros and cons of that variable, or lowered blood pressure, you know, in a patient. Now you're showing, you're a pretty, I don't want to say cheap, that's the wrong word, but a pretty inexpensive intervention that's very cost effective. There is a necessity to do that kind of work, even though I know it's antithetical to really what you're about in practice.
I mean, sort of, but...
I know. Viva la difference.
Well, I guess you all are free to jump into. I didn't know we were contingent back here. Because I actually don't think it's antithetical. I mean, yes, framing the research that we do in certain ways can help us talk to administrators who manage money, certainly, but also at the end of the day, I think we would all agree that we are here for patients and families, and if something I'm doing isn't effective, I'd rather know that.
Yes.
And I'd rather know what is the most effective.
And wouldn't you like to know 13 minutes is enough?
I would love to know that. or to know that like something that I'm doing is there is actually no proven effect to it. So let's try something else. I mean that would help my practice and it would help the patients that we care for. So it's both and.
Well, and what you're talking about and others are too, and I do want to emphasize this in the presentation here today, is that something that seems a little lost in the literature I've been reading so far anyway, is that when we talk about evidence-based practice and we think about outcome studies, what's lost are what I would call process studies. You know, it's great if you've got an effect, but we're back to the point someone made, but you need to know where that effect came from. So process studies really are studying the who are you as chaplains, what do you do, how do you do it, when do you do it, why do you do it, and the impact on those outcomes that are being determined. Because you're absolutely right, if you don't know why it's effective, then you're just back to seat of the pants, trial and error.
Right, and then we can't replicate it as a profession. We can't all like talk about what works and what doesn't work, and then improve as a profession. And by doing so, improve patient, family, staff care. Absolutely. Which is why we're here.
And another piece, how do you even establish competencies across preparation programs, training programs for chaplains? That's why it's important for every piece of this, but process studies are very important in that regard.
You know, thank you for raising that, Mary, because it also raised for me when a few years ago, first getting involved in healthcare reform and the processes and how that would impact us and all. And trying to do some things in the department to bring our awareness around that, to raise it. I realized at some point, because we were initially feeling sort of defensive about, are we going to be railroaded out of a job because whatever. And it's easy for me to take the, to be morally superior, because I think, well, you can't put $1 and cents on everything we do, blah, blah, blah. But then I realized, however, I do put $1 and cents on what I get reimbursed. So I actually do have some concerns about the dollar of existence. I'm not really floating in some, place like that. So what that raises for me for myself is, how do I cultivate interest and participation and shaping research such that it's something I'm doing to contribute to the viability of the whole healthcare endeavor, rather than simply find a way to defend that I'm just sure I'm doing something good and you should value it better.
You're absolutely right. And so whether you're conducting the research, which is not the goal of these workshops, but understanding and critically evaluating the research, when you're called upon to make a case for your services, when you're called upon to train and supervise students in residency or internship on particular ways of doing your work, that you have that research basis as part of your knowing. I loved something someone said yesterday when I said, you know, it can't all be completely intuition that drives the way we work. He said, intuition comes from being well prepared. And so I think that to me shows that hand-in-hand process outcome research with those other ways we have of knowing. And to use that as additional, you know, support for what we're doing. So I'm glad you brought that up. Well, we've probably covered most of the slides that are still sitting up here on the overhead, which I knew we would. Let me run through a few more, and they're going to really summarize many of the comments you've already made. I really like this quote from one of the articles that was assigned for today from Hanzo et al. It did talk about the reality that you were raising of some of the impetus for the research is about valued outcomes. And of course the question is, whose values? If it's the values of people that do deal with the budgets and the cost, then they are interested in reduced cost. They're also interested in improving quality of care and patient experience. And the common ways that's looked at is satisfaction and or enhanced health outcomes, like cure rates, reduced rate of stay, reduced use of healthcare resources. Those are not the only outcomes, but they are some.
And many of those are patient-driven too.
Yes.
When we're the patient, these are things we also want.
Yes.
To not pay as much.
Right.
Yes.
To heal faster.
Yes.
To have the kind of care we want, to the setting we want it. So
I had a recent experience, and I still just kind of laughed to myself when I heard this. I was visiting someone in a hospital, and I heard a young lady patient, walking down the hall with her nurse and interpreter. And I heard the interpreter saying to the nurse, she's saying, they're not giving anything to me and no one's been in, what's the point? So I was thinking of that when you gave that example. It's like, patients don't understand what's the point. You're right. Patients have a right to have a place at the table in directing research initiatives. And I know increasingly in research that's grant funded, that often the grantors require community involvement into the development of the proposal, so that it isn't just the academicians sitting up here and to some extent some of the practitioners. These are not exhaustive, but just a few examples of things I've seen in different papers. That, again, the topics can be endless. You can really come at this from any direction that you want, and you're making an inroad. And I'll just leave those there for you to kind of look at. My point about the process, again, going right to the outcome in some ways could be a mistake to start there when you don't even know who you are or what you do. And I don't mean that you don't know who you are and what you do. But if there is a literature that says there's a generalizable set of data around who chaplains are and what they do, and who the patients are and what matters to the patients, as you were saying, you may be way off on the outcomes that you're looking to assess. So I would suggest you watching for that, and hoping that papers would have some explanation of the theoretical basis or prior research basis for creating the question that they're investigating. Specifically, process studies are the what and the how that then lead to the what effect. This looked better on my PowerPoint at home. I don't know if that's even visible to everyone, but in a sense, this is again my point that you have so much reach to so many people in so many ways that any of these avenues could be places to be critically reading literature, and of course for people to be conducting studies. Everything from public services of worship, public and patient involvement, training, committee work. That little dark one down there, I think, is program development. And in the middle circle is with patients, staff members, or family members. So you really are interfacing with the whole world in the healthcare system. And again, to me, hand in hand, both kinds of studies. Sometimes you'll see a study that's actually looking at a process, well identified, to then look at an outcome. Just random question. Do you ever read a paper that's talking about a particular topic and you think, what in the world are they talking about? What are they studying? And I don't mean it because you didn't understand the concept. Really important that people try to give a conceptual definition of the variables they're studying, but then also, as much as they can, an operational definition, which means trying to describe it as specifically and behaviorally as possible, that someone else reading it would know what was going on. So if someone says, I was looking at empathic engagement of the chaplain with the patient, what does that really mean? What does that look like? And if a paper doesn't get to that level, it's kind of hard to really know, well, then what was the process, what was the outcome? That said, very difficult to operationalize human interaction kinds of dynamics and variables. Very difficult, but not impossible. Really impossible. But there you also kind of want to watch that you don't go like too reductionistic. I still remember this example one of my students gave, you know, if you defined love as the number of kisses per minute, that would really vary on whether that was your partner or your dog. So the dog would win big time.
My dog. Love is love.
Love is love.
Love is love.
For the dog.
My dog was my
So
dog.
try to look for how things are being defined to really get at what somebody's looking at. Okay, now we've done this a little bit, but let me just kind of throw this out to the whole group rather than dyads or anything. We've talked a bit about kinds of evidence. The epic was mentioned. What other kinds of evidence do you think are around in the world of chaplaincy that could be used for research?
Patient reporting.
Patient reporting. Okay.
Survey.
Surveys.
I've read about in Chicago, I think at one of the sites they're using for CP, they're using and staff simulations with trained actors. So what would that be? So it's not actual.
Role play.
Analog, some people
Is
call
that
it.
what it's called? Okay.
Some do. I mean, in psychology it would be analog,
Okay.
but role play is the method, probably, and it's simulated.
Interactions with patients who are paid actors who are trained to be certain type of person.
In medicine, that's a standardized patient that's used often with medical students and nursing students.
I got paid to do that.
You got paid to do it in college, to be the patient.
So, like, I read a lot of studies early on that were about who's asking for a chaplain, why would they ask for a chaplain? That kind of evidence, like, you know, this percentage of patients ask for this, or who don't ask for that, or, you know.
And even that raises, you know, one research study, when well done, or even when not, should raise more questions than it answers. Because right away as you said that, I thought about who asks for the chaplain, what happens if they're offered a chaplain? Would the data look a little differently?
And who offers it?
And who offers it? How do they offer it?
Yeah.
I'd say another secondary piece of this is one related to education. It's not just about what the chaplain does with the patient, but how the chaplain learns, or if the chaplain learns, how to engage a patient and their skill set. What's the effectiveness of education and how do we measure that?
Huge, huge. How do we know that the training, the education has any effect? And if so, what that effect is? And how does that interact with the myriad of life experiences and individual and cultural characteristics a person brings to their work as a student, along with all the things, the same things that the trainer or educator brings.
As we're talking, I'm realizing I kind of need you to define the word evidence.
Yeah, I was going to ask
Because I
Paul
don't
to do
really-
that.
Really, I don't know if I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
Or what research means by that.
Yeah, what do you think evidence means?
Proof.
Proof?
Proof. Research findings.
Support. Fact.
Demonstrated outcome for now.
Demonstrated outcome for now.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that we have, and yet we find out later that wasn't what we really would have considered evidence. But we did at the time.
And demonstrated outcomes specifically linked to the hypothesis, I'm thinking.
Well, sometimes the outcomes are serendipitous, meaning you get things that totally surprise you.
Yeah, but I mean, but then what would you say those are evidence?
What do you think?
Well, I'm thinking
That's what I'm
evidence is the what do you call it? The data or the like if I pull patient satisfaction surveys, that's evidence that I might use. It's evidence that's been created by some method. So the evidence is the to me it's not the, you haven't even come up with the study yet. You're just using evidence to build your.
And it sounds like you differentiated. There's the what kind of evidence and then how you get that evidence. That then may contribute to an outcome, may be irrelevant to the outcome that you were investigating. Some may support, some may refute. All kinds of evidence. I think I actually put in a slide defining evidence, but you've again done it.
Good.
Oxford Living Dictionary, the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. So you've got the textbook definition, and there's all the synonyms. But then also thinking about where do you find your evidence? Now, you kind of started down that track of talking to patients. Again, that EPIC medical record.
I'm curious about just trying to understand the definition. Is evidence pre-interpretation or post-interpretation?
What do you think?
Well, I've been I'm coming into the conversation thinking it's pre-interpretation, that we interpret the evidence and then arrive at a finding.
You know, were you going to jump in there?
I'm sorry.
Oh, different?
I have a question about what experimental studies, how they connect to evidence studies.
Okay, well, I think it does kind of connect where I was going with your question. I'm thinking that Paula Forte will probably talk about this in her 2 workshops on qualitative and quantitative. The answer is yes to both. That it really depends on the paradigm you're coming from and the way you're trying to investigate whatever you want to investigate.
Okay.
Quantitative research often starts with a theoretical basis and or a basis of prior evidence, and then seeks to try to further corroborate or dispel what is already believed or known. Qualitative research there are certain methods that can take that approach, but many of them are more what's called phenomenological or inductive, where you go and you try to see what's there, and from that figure out the evidence or the data. So you go in without a pre-existing framework in those kind of studies. So the answer is both. And I guess here's another thing, when you open up a paper trying to figure out which perspective were they coming on from that. Were they coming saying, here's the theory and we're out to find evidence for it? We already have some evidence, or we have no idea. You know, out of my own world, I'm thinking about the last couple of phenomenological studies students did. One was on the lived experience of emerging adult age women who have alopecia areata, which is hair loss. No pre-existing framework. Because what my student figured out was the previous research that had been done was presuming a very psychologically dysfunctional view. And she's like, you know, where's the evidence that there isn't a positive way of coping and dealing with that kind of condition? So, long answer to, really the answer is yes, both. And again, the experimental tends to come from evidence.
So I'm thinking, we come across in the hospital, we hear about experimental interventions. What does that mean? Are they evidence-based, but maybe because they're similar to previous studies, but it's a totally new intervention, so it's called experiment? What does that mean?
Oh, okay.
Because my understanding is experimental would mean that that particular intervention has not been tried.
Well, it depends on whether the experiment is about how the whole study is designed, or the experiment is on something that's being attempted, like a brand new intervention. You have to read carefully to where are they using the term experiment in the paper. If it's something that's never been tried before, then yes, it's absolutely experimental, right? We're trying to figure out if mindfulness-based interventions would have an impact on smoking cessation. That's been done, so I know it's not a good example. But if it had never been done, that would be an experimental intervention that you're trying to study to see what the effect is. Experiment also, though, has to do with the type of design. And in that case, it usually means that there's been a tightly controlled study where you often have a group that gets an intervention, could be an old tried and true intervention or not. Then you have a control group that either gets no intervention or something that's considered innocuous placebo. Or you might have a comparison group where this group gets one intervention, this group gets a different kind. And then you look to see how they differ in whatever your outcome measure is. That's a true experiment because you're trying to tightly control as many variables as you can. Related to that, you might limit the gender, the age, other variables that you think might play an important role in outcome. You might only have like women of a certain age in the study. This is a quick example. And I know I'm not being as articulate as Paula will be on this, but you raise a good point that a lot of terms that are in papers are very confusing, and sometimes the authors may or may not use them accurately. So you have to really read.
Great.
But you know what? I would say you don't have to, you could say you knew nothing about research, and you could go to a paper and know this isn't making sense.
Yeah.
Something seems off here. And the thing again that you always at the bottom line have is you have lived firsthand experience in your profession to go, just doesn't seem right. Let me look a little deeper to figure out how they could have gotten this finding. Or, and really even more importantly, at the bottom line is always, so what? You see these findings and you go, who cares?
That's right.
Are they meaningful or aren't they? And that's where you're a great judge of that. So whether they're using the terms right or not, you'll know.
So, okay, this, I'm kind of going out on a limb with terms here, but is experimental research always phenomenological?
Oh, phenomenological, that term is usually limited to qualitative kinds of studies. Interview studies, individual interviews, focus group interviews, ethnographic kind of research where you might go and live in a community and observe. It's a totally different paradigm, and I don't want to go too far into that today because you're going to get, I think, a lot better organized representation of it. Sorry. Okay. But experimental tends to relate more to the quantitative paradigm. Okay. Thank you. Tends to relate more to that. But again, always remember that if somebody's trying something brand new, you know, like an experimental curriculum, that may have nothing to do with the way it's going to be researched, but it does have to do with the fact that the intervention itself has never been done before. Okay. So that helps. Kinda.
Yeah. Like what we're doing right now.
All right, well, let's see where we are. Keep an eye on time here. So, oh, just some things that I saw in the literature. To me, these are at more general levels rather than specific sorts of things, but the idea of evidence can come across more than one institution where chaplains are in service, especially if your staff is relatively small and you're in the experimental side of quantitative research. People tend to look for larger sample sizes in the quantitative work. So a great way to do that is to go across more than one institution. So you have a bigger sample size, and you can argue that there's more similarity or generalizability across chaplains. It's not specific like just to the fair use system. Data from the electronic medical records can be a source. in-depth case studies of chaplain care. And I'm going to look, I believe there is a paper that will be coming in one of your assigned readings that talks about what an in-depth case study would look like. Those, to me, are right in your wheelhouse, because that's the work that many of you, I'm assuming, do. And that's a great way of doing research, and I agree with Fitchett that it's a shame there's not more of that by experienced chaplains. The standardized patient interviews, now we're in the more qualitative side of things, structured, semi-structured, unstructured. Structured is where you essentially it's almost like reading a survey to somebody, that you don't deviate from what's on the page. Semi-structured, you ask questions in approximately the same order, but you can elaborate and sidebar a bit depending on what your participant says. Unstructured, you go in and just talk. One that I've never had the guts to do as a researcher, because I'm not sure what I would do with the data when I got it back, but nevertheless, different ways of doing it. And then we've got, again, the term we've used a lot, which is evidence-based, and that it's very popular and prominent right now in many medical fields, many of the disciplines, and it has a lot to do with the belief that with evidence-based practice, that is a way of enhancing patient care. Ultimately, most people that are interested in evidence-based research are interested in designing manualized treatment. That's the term in psychology. I right away go to my bias and go, I don't want a cookbook, because, for obvious reasons, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. When I'm a little more open about it, I'll show you a slide in a couple of minutes, but maybe you're a little more open than I. What do you think about the idea of evidence-based chaplaincy research? And I wrote there, why do you think it's important? But now I'm thinking maybe I should have said, do you think it's important? And so why?
Gosh, I think it would totally depend on the question and the kind of study. I mean, I certainly don't want to be limited in my interventions by a study. So I would be interested to hear what the study had to say, for sure. But I don't want to be limited by something that would occur in the moment that might be the most brilliant thing to do in the moment, but it's not one of the now known good interventions.
I talk about that as the soup du jour. Something gets out there, it catches people's attention because it seems to be great, and then 5 years later it's gone. So you're right about being careful about jumping on something that's more a fad than something with well-documented impact. Your comment also about not jumping too fast from one study to thinking that this is, a great intervention for most people. And even being careful about, you didn't say this, but the reductionism, I think you were implying.
I wasn't.
Back in the day, I'm old enough to remember the studies that were equating empathy with the forward lean in the chair. It's like, that's all it took. We'd have a much better society, I think. But again, being also careful about recognizing that the gestalt, the whole, is always greater than the sum of those pieces. I'm sorry, I think I'm answering the question I asked you. What else would people like to say about it?
Well, I need to say, if you didn't get a chance to hear the healthcare chaplaincy webinar that was out in October about Pulaski, is that
Pahalski, Christina?
Yeah, Polchowski, a big researcher in evidence-based chaplaincy. I mean, I thought she had some really good points about reductionism and some things that she's learned by doing the research to kind of help us not get pulled into things that aren't really all that helpful. So anyway, maybe I could try to summarize that somehow, or we could get a summary of that, because she's already been ahead of this and has some suggestions.
She's already being cautionary?
She's already being cautionary, and so that's what I think of when I see evidence-based chaplaincy now.
Well, the other thing, and I imagine Paula will mention this, is that when you're in more of the quantitative side, you're looking at averages, normative, meaning, and it's the term is nomothetic. You're looking at the group means. So, if this side of the room generally liked the 13-minute consult. This side of the room generally like the 30-minute consult. It's losing the fact that some of the people over here wanted 30 minutes and some of the people over here wanted 13. So there's always that tension of when you're looking at on average, it doesn't apply to an individual, but also the recognition that when it's the individual, it may not have a lot of meaning for everybody else in the group. So we're always trying to do our best, but recognizing that research, again, does not fully direct what we're going to do in the moment. And that's where I come back to something I don't even know that I said, but I would argue that you are a researcher every single time you're with your clientele, your patients, your staff, whatever. Because what are you doing? You're trying to figure out the best way to intervene with that individual. You're assessing how you seem to be doing. You're figuring out the goals, the best way to proceed. That's research. It's research.
You know, when I think of the importance of evidence-based research, I keep coming back to behavioral health because that's my primary area. And I think of patient and staff safety. Like you just said, a lot of the daily research that myself and colleagues have done to learn what's not helpful. What well-intentioned interventions create unsafe environments, or when we need to step back and not be empathetic, when we need to almost do the opposite to how we might standardly practice as a chaplain. But I think the more evidence-based research that can come into the world of behavioral health chaplaincy, the better standards for safety, for perceived interventions, for outcomes, and so on that could be.
I think it's a point well taken, and you're really raising a great point that needing to look holistically at the work, not just what seems to be effective, but what might be harmful to anybody involved in the practice. And then the piece that you're absolutely right, I don't want to go overboard and say too much, be too skeptical about everything that you read. There are things that eventually you realize are common themes. And in a sense, it's almost like you're being a qualitative researcher the more you read in literature. I mean, I cannot think that 70 years of research that shows that the working alliance in human services work has a powerful impact on outcome. Working alliance being the extent to which you and the person receiving your care agree on the goal and the task, and you feel a bond with each other. It's there. It's not explaining 100% of the outcome. Nothing does. But it's a big common factor that comes up over and over and over. Well, there you go. That's something that you really can say, okay, 9 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, a little empathy is going to go a long way. On the other hand, remember the old Bandler and Grindler, and you figured out where people were, whether they were thinking, hearing, or speaking more in the way they communicated, and that was going to contribute to psychotherapy outcome. Came and went in about 5 years. So, and everything in between. So for this, in terms of the sake of time, I'm going to go through a couple more slides. Honestly, you covered things so well in your comments that I'll just maybe highlight a few things that perhaps we didn't emphasize. Well, back again, to give, again, credibility to the importance of research, Kurt Levine, or Lewin, depending on how you pronounce his name, out of psychology, said experience alone does not create knowledge. It contributes a lot to it, but it, in and of itself, it's not the only way of knowing. I really like Fitchett's comment that everybody doesn't have to be a chaplaincy researcher, but it's important to be research literate for many of the reasons that we talked about already, so I'm not going to have us repeat those. This is a slide I wanted to get to that really speaks against my initial impulse that manualized treatments or evidence-based practice is a cookbook, is that really what you want to do is be pulling in pieces of the evidence along with your expertise and opinion as clinicians, very much with attention to the perspective of your patients, and that it's this mutual influence of the three that when you kind of put it all together can really create effective practice that leads to desired outcomes. A little blurry, but essentially evidence-based research that leads to practice says you start with formulating an important question. You try to track down the best evidence you can get to answer the question. You critically evaluate perhaps the validity or accuracy and consistency of that information, to then integrate whatever you found into your practice, to then go way back up to start all over again because, of course, no terminal skill level in what we do. The why, many of the things you've already said. I'll see if we're ending up here we have not talked about. Well, one thing we haven't said, and I think this is very important as well, is differentiating what is unique about your profession and you from other professions. I know in my world, the research a long time ago figured out that someone can't differentiate a social worker from a psychologist from a psychiatrist. We know the differences, but the public doesn't. And so it's really important to demonstrate what's unique as well as what's similar, but the uniqueness. Why is there a role for you? Talked about some of those others. Educating the public and colleagues about what you have to offer. You may be a great unknown resource to certain elements of the public or colleagues. Very much prevent harm to others. You said that. Not only harm to the researchers and practitioners, but harm obviously to the people that you care for. So ensuring a standard of care. That really to me is the punchline on the reason for research, is to ensure that the best we can know that we're providing the care that people deserve. Again, back to the quality for the patients and their families. First and foremost, never losing sight of that. And we've already identified a number of challenges, so again, if you'll bear with me, I'll just run through a couple more slides quickly. But you really have been doing a good job of talking about the tensions and the strains from the opening minutes today of like, well, everything's biased, you're right, to other things. We talked about that difficulty of quantifying and operationalizing variables like presence, empathy, connection. Historically, if you have been trained to be more process-oriented and in the moment, then again, this sort of idea of evidence-based research can seem a little antithetical to some, but not all, or it can just feel a little uncomfortable. Needing to have a consensus of outcomes. And according to Hanzo et al., the consensus isn't quite there yet in the world of chaplaincy. Different people have different opinions. So that's a great place for people to be contributing. What are the outcomes that are important? Again, the process studies are every bit as needed as outcome studies. Always, you know, unless maybe you work at the NIH, and I don't even know about then, the funding and the resources and the training tend to be limited. That doesn't mean you can't do research. You just have to maybe not bite off more than you can chew. And then one that, you know, I think sometimes is there a little bit is, you know, you've heard that saying, don't ask a question you don't want the answer to. But sometimes I think we're afraid that we're going to find out something that makes us look bad. And if you're an honest researcher, you report those data as well. So maybe a fear that there's not value to what you do. I really don't believe that. That's my intuition, and in my heart of hearts cannot believe that's the case. There I'm again back to the findings are easy to get, but the work is in figuring out how to interpret why those findings happened. And of course, my favorite, which I guess, yes, set in your ways, is that the term? Because we've always done it that way. Well, you know, there is a certain inertia around doing something that hasn't been part of standard practice. We didn't really talk about this. We talked about the fact that anxiety reduction isn't always the desired outcome. But how about the idea that, do you think that your effect always would show up right away? You do your 13 minutes and then you give them a questionnaire?
Right.
You know, the effects may not show up immediately. They can take days, weeks, months. So being careful about studies that exclusively go, we did a post-test immediately after. Ideally, there's follow-up over time. Even if you get a desired outcome immediately, does it last more than 2 days, 2 weeks, a month? that behavioral health, yeah, people are gonna like stick to that diet, and you talk to them in 6 weeks, and they're like, what diet? Yeah. So that's an issue. If prevention is part of what you're studying, it's a really tough sell. Prevention of depression, preventing disconnection from one's spiritual community. I don't know if you've ever heard that kind of joke, but really not, where the train conductor is on the train and he's blowing his whistle every 15 minutes, and finally a passenger says, "What are you doing that for?" And he said, "To keep the elephants off the track." And the passenger says, "I don't see any elephants." He goes, "See, it works." That's the problem with prevention. So that's a tougher kind of bias. The fact that we often do study what's easy rather than maybe is what is most important, because it's harder to obtain. And the risk that we do study what matters to us rather than to what matters to the patients and others.
So here's an interesting conversation I've had with Paul Goucher over the years. So if I have a patient, let's just say, who has never done any personal reflection in their lives, let's just say, so what matters to them, they don't know what matters to them, but they don't know that it might be helpful to know what matters to them, even though we both don't know what that is at this point.
Yeah.
So I've been studying, for most of my adult life to deepen my insight and understanding of something, and my lovely person in front of me has no interest in that, which is okay. So it does matter to me because I know they're suffering, but they don't know they're suffering. So, so in a way, like, how do I address that last bullet point?
Studying what matters to you.
Yeah.
I think that's really a question around when people are so different from how we are. All the books will go, you need to be versatile and flexible, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
of course.
and of course we try, we attempt. Well, what do you think? What do you do in a case like that?
Well, I mean, I know what to do as a chaplain, but I'm talking about it up there. Like what, we might be studying something that matters to us because we have this larger perspective and we've been training for years. And the person, so I don't have any problem with that as a chaplain, that's not a problem. It's up there as a problem.
Well, and maybe what you're really saying there is that it's important to go to patients and their families to find out what's important to them.
Yeah.
And have that, there's nothing wrong with studying what you feel to be important and what you feel is your strong suit, because it is effective with some people some of the time. But it's maybe trying to broaden that and say that the outcome is going to differ according to different patients somewhat.
Of course.
Yeah. Because I know, I just said that, I was thinking of papers where I was reading on using reflective frames to do work in genetic counseling, and how the researchers were saying some patients have no interest in that. They want the biomedical information, lay off.
Right.
The other ones want to discuss.
Right.
But see, you've already figured that out. You are assessing your patients to know not to go there. There's your answer.
Yeah.
And so
Well, I mean, I know what I'm saying is, I'm just concerned that that dot is up there.
Yeah.
Because if we only studied a patient who said, I don't want to talk more about my spirituality, and that's where they're at.
Yeah.
We can talk about their truck, that's totally fine. But if there would be a problem.
But if the research question was around, did the person feel they connected with you?
Yeah.
Then it doesn't matter what you talk about.
Exactly. Well, that's
So you've got to watch.
I mean, that's
yeah. And I think I have a couple final slides that speak to what you were just saying.
Can I add one more about the maybe importance for the research, or for shifting our focus this way? Came to me for the readings because I hadn't really thought about it before. The fact that a preponderance of staff and providers will say, yes, it's a good thing that we have chaplains and they do good stuff, and that's really great. And they don't know what we do. But they think it's good. And when I read that, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm sure that's so. That accords with my experience, but I've never thought about the fact that that's not useful to us or the patients either.
No.
That we somehow have a minimal impact if we only operate in this little enclave,
exactly,
where the people outside think, we know there's good stuff going in there, We don't know what all those smells and sounds mean, but it must be good.
Yes, like your magicians or something like that. So that suggests to me that begs for you figuring out who in the hospital sees and hears what you were doing and doing careful interviewing to try to get specifics other than just, I know you do a good thing. I'm just going to guess the nurses see and hear what you're doing more than the doctors do. And maybe the people that come in, heck, the people that come in, I don't mean to be disparaging. I'm thinking about the staff that comes in and they're tidying the room while you're in there. They're observing you. That's maybe your population, not, you know, someone else. So it really is around creative and, again, comprehensive ways to try to go. And the bottom line on what you do with anything that you're reading is something that was cautioned like over a century ago by somebody in psychology, Gordon Paul, who, when he was looking at the evidence-based psych guide in psychology, said, it's what treatment, by whom, is most effective with this individual for that specific problem under what set of circumstances. Keep that in mind and you'll never overinflate or totally discard what you're finding in the literature. With that, we are like at time, and so thank you so much for your attention.
Many thanks.
Looking forward to seeing you in February.
Thanks so much, Pat.
A housekeeping thing, we're having a group right away, so please take conversations out into the hall.